Hello friends, fellow modelers and hobby enthusiasts. In this video, let me show you how I build, customize, and paint a certified Super Robot Classic, the Bandai Master Grade 1/100 scale God Gundam from the legendary mobile fighter G Gundam. Ooh, God Gundam. This is the 44th Master Grade in Bandai's legendary catalog of Master Grades, and we really haven't gotten an updated version since then in the MG line. In my opinion, the high resolution model, or RG, doesn't really count, although they are nice models in their own right. The making of this video, that's 24 years ago, so this kit is old, and its age does show, but with a bit of love and modeling skills, I feel like I can really do it some justice. Quite a nostalgia trip for me as well. Like many other kids growing up in the 1990s to early 2000s in the USA, I was introduced to G Gundam through an English dubbed version that aired on cable TV, specifically on the Toonami segment of Cartoon Network back in the golden age. You may have heard of it. Ah, the good old days. I acquired this kit through a friend in my local Gunpla group, and he was nice enough to include the HY2M LED Godfinger set with a model. These were part of a line of official add-on parts and model kits that Bandai used to produce, but have since discontinued. Essentially, these are getting increasingly rarer and more expensive, so I'll be taking great care to incorporate this and to do this ancient relic some justice. These are also not reprints. They're an original run, which you can tell by the red Bandai logo and slight wear on the box. Pretty exciting stuff. Ooh, it's red. It's awesome. So sit back, pour yourself a nice drink, and let's build some plamo. With any Gunpla I know I'm going to fully customize, the first thing to do is familiarize myself with the kit. The best way to do that is to just simply build it. I call this the test assembly phase. Flipping through the manual and giving everything a quick glance, I can see in terms of parts count and overall size, the kit isn't really that large. One unique oddity I'd like to point out is the rubber parts, particularly on the normal hands and the bottom of the feet. I will be painting these, they'll just need a little more special attention. There are also quite a lot of ABS parts for mostly the mechanical frame details, as well as some of the clear parts for the beam sabers, Godfingers, and Corelander canopy. A handful of small metal screws and nuts are also included, probably to make the inner frame sturdier, which you also don't see much of in more recent Gunpla releases. One other cool feature Bandai used to do in a select few kits back in the day was include these little roughly 1/20th scale figurines of the pilots or characters from the series. This kit in particular comes with none other than the King of Hearts himself, Domon. I'll be cleaning and painting him up as well, of course. I'd also like to point out the jewel sticker for the chest of the Gundam. It's tough to see on camera, but there is a small King of Hearts emblem inside of the gem, which is pretty awesome that Bandai was able to include that detail. With all that being said, I kept a note of which parts are ABS, PS, rubber, and so forth. I also did a bit of Google Translate from Japanese to English using my phone to read some of the parts of the manual that I wanted to double check. Normally I wouldn't need this, but I needed to see if there were specific instructions for the screws and various other areas of the manual that are only in Japanese. To kick off the build, I unbag all the runners and do a quick parts check. I like to be pretty organized as I'm working, mostly to help me keep track of all my parts and to keep my workflow as smooth as possible, using sorting trays for my parts and tools, and an IKEA expandable dish rack to hold up my runners. Following the manual, I cut parts off the sprues with my Tamiya nippers and sorted them into little bins I labeled with masking tape and a pen, making sure to leave a small amount of plastic on each part. Once I have all my parts off the runners and sorted into bins, I repeat the process, but this time trimming off all the leftover gate plastic with my Godhand single-bladed nippers. This guy. To leave all my parts with a nice flush surface. Having trimmed all my parts flush, that's when I start sanding. Using a combination of my hobby knife and various grits of files and sponges, I work through each bin and each individual part, chiseling away any excess plastic, mold line, or surface defect. I usually start sanding at around 400 grit and then stop around 800 to 1000 grit. This process is pretty time consuming, so it helps to put on some headphones and listen to some music or show in the background to keep you company in the monotony of this procedure. To keep my parts and sanding tools clean, I use a combination of a toothbrush and a soft makeup brush, and then finish with a new useful tool I've recently taken a liking to using, reusable electronics cleaning gel. This is really useful for dabbing away all the fine dust left over and doesn't leave any residue. I prefer to clean off my tools and parts as I'm working, so my abrasives have the maximum amount of bite. This will also minimize any cleaning I'll have to do later, as well as reduce the amount of dust in my work area. I learned this trick of using the cleaning gel from a friend in my Gunpla group, and now I can't build without it. On clear parts, I made sure not only to remove the nub marks and mold lines, but to buff those parts to a glossy shine for future steps. For the Domon figurine, the process was a little bit more difficult. The figure has a mold line running through the entire length of the body, and the plastic is quite difficult to identify and sand away with the regular method. The plastic is also a lot spongier and elastic, and it frays apart in little strands when sanding. However, I figured out a solution that makes it much easier to deal with. I start first by marking the mold line with a permanent marker. making sure that the entire mold line is covered in marker ink. I left that to dry completely before moving on, just to make sure the marker doesn't smudge. The next step was simply filing away the mold line. I found that a coarse diamond grit needle file works perfectly for this. I focus on filing away the mold line using the marker ink as a guide. Once I see that marker ink disappear, I know that the mold line is gone. Pretty simple. To help smooth out the rough surface a bit, I use a 120 grit God hand sponge, followed by 220 and then 400. As a last step, I brushed the entire figure with Plastruck plastic cement to help soften any other rough surfaces and frayed bits. I then left that to dry for a couple of hours. This worked perfectly. The figure was now free of any mold lines and nearly all the surface imperfections. I was satisfied. The rubber parts of the kit also had a similar issue in removing mold lines and nub marks. Since it's rubber, I simply can't melt away the frayed bits with plastic cement, so I sanded those down as best I could. With the main Gundam body and domo now all cleaned up, I assembled the model to get an overall feel of the construction and aesthetics. This will give me all the info I need to improve any areas before I start getting ready to paint. I also cleaned and test assembled the LED HY2M Godfinger set of arms and hands. The truth. That's so cool! I found that they work perfectly and are a nice little addition to this kit. They even come with little stands to hold the arms that aren't in use. I decided at the last minute as a final touch to add to the kit to make a custom stand using a Bandai Action Base 4 in black. This Gunpla was released at a time where action bases really weren't a thing yet, so there's no real way to secure the Gunpla nicely. The action base comes with a few attachments, including a fork attachment to place over the crotch section for older action base incompatible kits, but ultimately, I decided to use the 3mm peg attachment for a more secure fit. To make this work with the model, I drilled a 3mm hole with my pin vise and Dremel to allow the peg to plug into the crotch. The hole is fairly hidden, and will be a much nicer fit to hold up the model in some action poses. With the whole kit and add-ons assembled, here's how the Gundam looks so far. Seeing a Gunpla put together like this always brings a smile to my face, and now I have a pretty good idea of how the kit comes together and how I can plan my painting work. There are still a couple areas I need to address before doing so. There are two very obvious seam line areas, the head and shoulders. So I'll take care of these areas first as I begin breaking down the kit for paint prep. Removing the seam lines on the shoulders is pretty straightforward work. All the parts connecting to the red shoulder areas don't require the pieces to be separated. There is a polycap part that connects to the arm that goes inside the shoulder, but this is a hidden part and can be left installed as I cement the two pieces together. So I just apply cement generously to the joining seam areas and then give a good squeeze. With that nice bead of that melted plastic squeeze out showing, I set the parts down to cure. Once completely dried and hardened, I sand away the raised bead of plastic that is squeezed out and completely smoothing out the surface to about 800 to 1000 grit. There is a thick panel line that runs between the two shoulder pieces, so to restore that, I carefully chisel it away with one of my Madwork scribers to match the same thickness of that line. Easy as pie. The seam line on the head was a little bit trickier to remove. The faceplate and the chin of the Gundam connect to the eye part, which sockets into the back half of the head. Essentially, it's not possible to remove the seam line without installing the face first, so I decided to modify the inside of the head to allow me to plug the face parts in after cementing. This was pretty simple. I just needed to trim a bit of the inside of the head and the connecting pegs to allow the face part to simply slide in. It holds itself in place just fine from friction alone, so no additional gluing or cementing is necessary. With that minor mod done, same as before, I apply cement generously to the seam and give the head parts a hard squeeze to get a bead of that melted plastic to squeeze out. After drying, I just sand away any melted plastic squeeze out as usual. After finishing the seam lines, I disassembled the rest of the kit carefully. The easiest way to disassemble a kit is to just follow the manual backwards and then group the parts in sections that will make sense to you. I grouped them by color since there aren't too many parts to go through. I'm familiar enough with the kit at this point to figure out how everything's going to come together when I do my final assembly later. It helps to have part separators and to go slow as to not accidentally break any parts or pegs. So I sorted these parts into small bins once more and got to work on the next step. The kit has pretty shallow panel lines, which might make it difficult to paint panel lines later on, so one way to improve this is to rescribe and deepen all the existing panel lines and create new ones in places that make sense. I really didn't create too many new ones. I only carved new lines on adjoining edges where it would make sense to have a panel line. This was mostly on the legs, head, and shoulders. Everything else on the kit just needed the lines to be deepened. To achieve this, I use a combination of high Q-part scribing tape, Tamiya masking tape, and Tamiya masking tape for curves to help guide my chisel on some of the really shallow lines. This is also just to make sure all my lines are straight and connect cleanly. General good practice is to start all the lines working from a small size chisel and gradually move up to larger sizes if needed. Most lines are started with my Wave HT253 carving needle and then finished with my Madworks Panaline chisels. The sizes I use are mostly 0.1, 0.15, 0.2, and 0.3 millimeters. These are good enough for 1/100 scale kits in my opinion. I try to use the same thickness whenever possible that already exists on the kit. For deepening existing panel lines, I do around maybe 5 to 6 passes and that's good enough. If the lines are really shallow, I may do up to 10 passes at most. I really try to make sure I don't go too deep when carving as you might get uneven lines or carve through the part. This process was very time consuming as I took care to make sure to be as neat as possible. Working through one group, one part at a time, I was able to rescribe all the panel lines across the kit. In the end, I feel that it's worth the effort and really upgrades the aesthetics. It's also really important to sand the edges of panel lines smooth to get them looking clean. Bits of raised plastic build up around edges and could make the panel lines look really messy, so sanding is a must. As a final step to smooth out the panel line channels, I dab a bit of Mr. Cement SP Black cement to run through the line. This will smooth out any roughness in the panel line channel, and it also works as a bit of a visual indicator that the panel lines are deep enough. After feeling satisfied with all my panel line carving, I sanded away all the cement marks that the applicator brush left with 1000 grit sanding sponges. I also took the opportunity here to go through all the parts in the kit and give everything a good sanding with the same 1000 grit sponges. Doing this extra step will ensure really good adhesion when I go to airbrush my primer in the next stages. To prepare my parts for paint, I gave all my parts a wash in the ultrasonic cleaner with a solution of distilled water and a very small amount of purple power mixed in. Purple Power is just an industrial grade degreaser that will ensure any kind of residue, oils, or mold release left on the parts is removed. I don't want to take any chances when I go to spray my paint. To ensure the parts are really clean, I also soak them in just distilled water after going through the ultrasonic cleaner, just for good measure. The ultrasonic cleaner does a really good job of removing any kind of trapped debris or dust in the very tight spots of the parts. It's very thorough. I highly recommend it as a tool if you're going to be doing a lot of paint prep or paint stripping as well. Once all my parts had a very thorough wash, I strained and drained away all the liquids and then laid down my parts on a towel. To speed up drying time, I used my airbrush with my air pressure turned up very high to blow away all the excess water trapped on the parts. I did this for every part and then left them on the towel to dry for a couple of hours. Everything was then mounted to mostly alligator clips on bamboo skewers for paint handling, with a few exceptions. Parts that didn't have any graspable areas are mounted to either masking tape, toothpicks, or double-sided tape and various clamps. I would say use whatever means necessary to make your parts easy to handle for airbrushing. There are so many ways, from poster putty to wine corks, just use whatever you have. A good rule of thumb is to place your mounting point in a hidden area that doesn't get painted. I like to plant all my skewers also into polyethylene packing foam sheets and cat scratchers. They make the perfect trays for this purpose. With all that tedium out of the way and my parts mounted, I can now get to the fun stuff: painting. But before I do, I want to introduce you all to the latest addition to my painting arsenal, the Gaahleri Mobius-TG. This is a trigger type, gravity fed, double action airbrush with a large 3-ounce color cup and a 0.5mm needle and nozzle. Full disclosure, Gaahleri reached out to me recently and was kind enough to send me an airbrush for review to show you all how it works in action. I heard nothing but great things about the performance of their airbrushes, and I'm feeling confident that I'll get great results. But I'll still be giving my honest thoughts and opinions as we put this through a practical application on a model kit. This could go horribly wrong, but I'm gonna take the risk. Anyways, straight away, first thing you'll see is a quick start guide to get the airbrush set up for spraying and a general guide on how to use the tool. I'm pretty well versed in using an airbrush already, but it doesn't hurt to read through this to be aware of the different features and proper usage, especially if this is something you're starting out with. In the box, you get a nice little baggie of 2 extra Teflon O-rings for what I'm assuming is the nozzle. This is great, as prolonged use with solvent-based paints, thinners, and cleaners can wear that out. Gaahleri also stocks and sells replacements for all the vital metal O-rings on your airbrush on their website, should the need arise. The airbrush itself is beautiful and feels really premium for its price point. It's very nice and feels really sturdy. A quick release adapter is already installed, so I can use this straight away with my compressor. The trigger action feels great, really smooth and very little resistance. The way this trigger airbrush works is that you pull back the trigger lightly and you'll feel it stop slightly. This is the threshold where the further you pull back, you'll release more paint. So up to this point, it's just air. That's where the double action part comes into play. On the rear, there is an adjustable fluid control knob to move a gate to how far back you pull the trigger. This controls the maximum amount of paint that comes out when you squeeze. The fan cap for wide spray patterns is also pre-installed, but the airbrush also comes with a round cap. The color cup is removable, which is convenient for cleaning. The cup is also polished on the inside, which looks fantastic, but I'm not sure how long that will last. I have to see if that tarnishes after months of prolonged use. Still, it's a nice feature. Right under the color cup, we have an adjustable MAC valve to fine control the amount of air being pushed through. This is useful if you need to adjust the air pressure on the fly. Some paints respond better to different air pressures, so being able to do that from the tool is a very nice feature. You also get interesting sputtering effect for weathering when turning the pressure really low. I personally won't be using it on this build, but it's nice to know I have the option there, so I'm going to leave the MAC valve completely open for now. Overall, my first impression is that this tool feels very premium. Everything fits together like a glove, and it's very comfortable to hold in the hand. Of course, the only way to truly know if this is a quality tool is by actually spraying through it. Whenever starting a paint job, it always helps to give things a bit of thought. Selecting all my paints and colors was a pretty smooth process. I've got a pretty good idea of what paints will work, and I'll show you what I use and my thought process behind it. Mostly everything on this build I'll be using is a lacquer, with a few exceptions. I start by making sure all my pieces have a good primer coat to build up from. Primer is a must if you really want good adhesion to your pieces and to ensure smooth paint application. For all the white armor pieces, I spray my own custom mixed gray primer. This is just Mr. Surfacer 1500 gray with a little bit of Mr. Surfacer 1500 black mixed in to create a darker gray. I test a bit of the spray with the new airbrush on the back of my black glove and then go to town on the pieces. My technique is just to flash the part with air first, so don't pull back the trigger past the first stop. After flashing with air, mist light coats over the whole piece, then flash with air again. Then go heavier with paint until I have good coverage. I do this to ensure the paint doesn't run and I get a smooth surface. Lacquer is a pretty forgiving paint to use, especially if you use a thinner with retarder in it like I do. It's still easy to go overboard, so once I see I have coverage, I stop and I move on. I repeat this technique for all my priming and clear coating. For all the red armor parts, I prime with Mr. Mahogany Surfacer 1000. The dark brown color will serve double duty as both a primer and shadow color for the red highlights later on. Using primer as a shadow color is a great way to prevent spraying too many layers of paint. On painted Gunpla, generally you'll want to keep paint layers as thin as possible to reduce fitting issues and friction on final assembly. Moving on to priming the blue parts, I use Mr. Base White 1000 as a primer. I'll be using brighter blues to shadow and highlight, so white is a good choice to keep the colors bright. I also use the white to prime the V-fins and eye parts, as these are getting some special colors first. More on that in a bit. For all the yellow parts, I use Mr. Finishing Surfacer 1500 Pink. Pink Surfacer is a great base for red and yellow themed paint jobs. It can help by making the yellow pigment stand out, facilitate zenithal highlighting, and provide a good undercoat for warm colors, keeping them vibrant. I had exactly enough paint left for this model, funny enough. For all the rubber parts and the Domon Kashu figure, I primed them with a special clear primer, Finisher's Multi-Primer. This primer allows you to paint over special pieces that don't adhere well to regular lacquer and other paints. This is great for materials like metal, resin, polycaps, rubber, and ABS. It thins with just regular hobby-grade lacquer thinner and sprays nicely. It also dries to a nice durable finish ready for the next layers of paint. It's also very easy to clean out of the airbrush. Speaking of which, the Mobius-TG is very easy to clean. Whether it's between colors or breaking the tool down between each session, the parts are easily accessible. I just flush the cup with some hardware store lacquer thinner and then wipe with paper towels and Q-tips between colors. When I'm breaking the airbrush down after each session, it's very easy to get to the soiled components and get those clean as well. The included guide and diagram also helps immensely with this process, so kudos to Gaahleri for including this again. Moving on, for all the gray and action-based parts, I sprayed a base coat of Tamiya TS14 Black. I decanted this from a rattle can and thinned it with just a little bit of leveling thinner. It doesn't need much. It just dries to a smooth glossy black, which is perfect for these parts, as they will all be getting metallic paint. I also sprayed this over all the rubber gray parts that I primed with the multi-primer. Returning to the Domon Kashu figure, I sprayed Mr. Surfacer 1500 Black as well over the multi-primer layer to begin establishing the shadow color for future steps. This is also where I switched to the fan cap on the Mobius-TG. The fan cap allows me to spray really wide lines, which is perfect for covering these large areas very quickly. This also helps reduce any texture from uneven spraying. To finish up these first coats, I also sprayed a gloss clear over all the clear parts. This includes the Godfingers, Beam Sabers, and Corelander canopy. This will leave a nice and shiny finish and remove any micro scratches from buffing away the mold lines and nub marks from prep. For this, I used Mr. Color GX 112 Super Clear 3 UV Cut Gloss. On the two V-fins, the head cameras are molded in. Those are supposed to be a bright green. I'll have to paint those now, mask them off, and then get to work painting the yellow. The eye parts also will be getting the same bright green. For this, I used a mix of Monument Hobbies Pro Acryl Fluorescent Green and Fluorescent Yellow. The color is mostly fluorescent green with a few drops of fluorescent yellow to bring up the brightness of the green a little bit. This is the only water-based acrylic paint I used on this build. It's thin for airbrushing with Vallejo airbrush thinner plus flow improver. With the now dry Domone, I misted a few coats of Mr. Base White 1000 over the model to establish some highlights and help me see the different sections a lot easier when I go to paint this in by hand later. I did the same thing with the even smaller Domone that's seated inside the Corelander. By now, all my previous primer coats are dried enough to begin layering the next coats of paint. This is the beauty of lacquer paint, it dries to a workable layer in just a couple of hours. I start by spraying all my metallic colors over the now glossy black parts. For the majority of the inner frame parts and action base, I use Gaia Notes color 1002 Dark Stainless Silver. Continuing with metallics, for the verniers on the Corelander, I sprayed Mr. Color 104 Gun Chrome. Side note, this is one of my favorite metallic colors. While I set those to dry, I sprayed a gloss clear coat to seal in and protect all the acrylic fluorescent green colors I sprayed. For this, I used Mr. Color GX 112 UV Cut Clear Gloss once more. The lacquer clear protects the underlying acrylic for my next masking and painting steps. Returning to my metallic pieces, to improve the quality of the finish, I gave all the pieces a light buffing with a gloved hand and various soft paint brushes. This helps to reduce any rough texture and smoothen out the finish. Some of the metallic parts I found easier just to paint in sub-assemblies, so I repositioned and opened those areas that needed it and touched those up with dark stainless silver once again. Upon looking at my metallics, I decided that some of the areas were a bit too bright for my taste, so I airbrushed Mr. Color GX 101 Clear Black over the hands and the action base hexagons. I then set those aside to dry. Well, I set out to add color to the rest of the kit. To create a shadow color for all the yellow parts, excluding the V-fins, I sprayed Gaia Notes Nazca Color Flame Red. I realized at this point that I would need to paint the V-fins the same color, so I masked off the green lens parts on the V-fins with Mr. Hobby Masking Soul Neo Liquid Mask, and set that aside to dry as well. Shifting my focus to the blue parts, I base coated everything with Mr. Color 80 Cobalt Blue to establish the shadow color, and then move on to the next step. Turning now to the completely dried and cured fluorescent green eye part, it was time to do what's called a reverse wash technique to paint the black border around the eyes. A really easy way to do this is to use enamel paint. With Tamiya X1 Enamel Gloss Black and a bit of lighter fluid, I mix an airbrushable consistency black to spray over the eye part. The enamel paint thins nicely with lighter fluid. It's also a lot less harsh than regular enamel thinner on plastic and paint jobs. Enamel has no adverse effect on completely dried lacquer paints either, so with a tightly wound swab soaked in lighter fluid, I carefully wipe away the black paint from the raised area of the eyes, only to reveal the green. Taking care to be careful and not wipe away the black border of the eyes, hence reverse wash technique. This is a really easy way to paint the recesses of Gundam eyes or emblems on something like the Shinanju. It leaves you with a really clean appearance. I'll be top coating this with a flat clear later to remove the glossiness of the black. I'd also advise to make sure you clean your airbrush right away when doing this. Moving back to the Corelander, I sprayed a layer of Mr. Color GX 104 Clear Green over the entire canopy to tint it green. This looks way cooler than just a plain clear canopy in my opinion, and leaves a nice glossy finish. Changing my mind yet again, I decided I didn't like how dark the hands look now with the clear black over them, so I sprayed Zerk Gunmetal over those hands and liked how that looked much more. Returning back to the V-fins, with the now dried masking fluid over the green, I went ahead and sprayed those Nazca Flame Red like the rest of the parts that will be yellow soon. Directly following this, I sprayed Nazca Color Mandarin Orange as kind of a middle tone before I went to spray yellow. I focused on spraying the wide areas of each piece, leaving the highest points and the select edges to still have some of that red still poking through. The final step, which is going over each of those pieces again, but with Mr. Color 4 Yellow. This is a bright yellow that will serve as the brightest highlights of the subtle gradient I'm creating. I'm only focusing on the centers of each piece where I want the brightest highlights to be placed. To finish off the pieces, I just missed very light coats of yellow from much further back over the entire parts to blend everything together. It's a very subtle effect, but really brings up the saturation and vibrance of all the parts I want to read as yellow. Continuing on with highlights, I began spraying Nazca Color Million Blue on the cobalt blue parts. My technique here is quite similar. I like to start from the center of each panel and build up the color slowly, working my way outwards, taking care to leave some of the edges darkened by the cobalt blue to create some subtle shading. Once I finish each side, I spray further from the piece, misting light coats of the Million Blue over the entire part to blend in the darker edges of the cobalt blue smoothly with the brighter Million Blue. I want to keep my shading fairly subtle, so I'll be repeating this process for the rest of the parts. Moving on to the next set of highlight colors, I repeat the same highlighting and blending process using Nazca Color Flame Red over all the dark brown parts that I primed with the mahogany surfacer. Dark brown makes a harmonious shadow color for the bright red. Same technique as the blue. Spray center of each panel, and blend in the edges by misting lighter coats from further back. At this point, I had a little debate on how I wanted to do the shading on the white armor parts. There are so many ways you can go about doing it. Ultimately, I decided to base coat all the white parts with Nazca Color Million Blue. I quite like a soft blue as a subtle shadow color for white, so I went ahead and coated all those completely with the blue. Directly following this, I sprayed the highlight color using my usual techniques of blending using Gaia Color Ultimate White. Exactly the same process as before, work my way from the center of each panel, then blend shadows to my personal level of subtlety. If you want to try this shading technique for yourself, it helps to practice on scrap pieces or spoons. There's so many ways to do shading, and this really comes down to what suits your personal taste. This is just my preferred way. At this point in the build, we've established most of the color already. Most of the inner frame parts and action bases are finished, so I leave those as is. Anything that doesn't have visible panel lines or won't get decals are pretty much done at this point, so I don't top coat anything I don't need to. The V-fins and eye part at this point are also done, as well as the yellow claws for what I'm calling the gauntlets. So I go ahead and top coat those parts with Mr. Color GX113 UV Cut Clear Flat to seal those in and finish them. I then set those aside with the rest of the finished pieces. For everything else that has panel lines, or areas that have details that still need painting, or areas that will be getting water slide decals, I'm going to seal and top coat those in with a gloss clear. A gloss clear coat at this stage will just ensure all my hard painting work up to this point is protected from the next steps, which will include painting with oil paints, acrylics, and water slide decals. Think of it as saving your progress. So to seal these parts in, I use Mr. Color GX112 UV Cut Clear Gloss. I spray this over the Corelander canopy, the white, red, yellow, blue parts, and some of the metallic parts that will still need attention. I let this dry and cure overnight before moving forward with my next steps. The next day, I decided to do all the water slide decals first. What I ended up choosing was kind of a mix of third-party decals I found on AliExpress. These include replacements meant for the RG God Gundam, the high-resolution model God Gundam, and the Master Grade Gundam F90. And a random mix of caution markings from other sets I have. To figure out placement, I referenced a few of the manuals for these sets I found online, and just some intuition. I ended up only using a few decals off these sets and placed them where I felt made sense. I didn't go too crazy with them. Applying water slide decals is really easy. A lot of the ones I acquired are from a Flaming Snow brand I found on AliExpress. They are really high quality, and the markings release from the film really quickly after soaking in water. They are also fairly thin and don't need much decal solution to adhere. The way I like to do decals is cut your selected marking, soak them in water using tweezers, and let the markings sit for a few seconds. The marking should release from the film pretty easily. I then gently slide away and pick up the marking with my tweezers and carefully move that to the desired spot. Try my best to be quite gentle, as decals can be quite delicate. After getting the decal in the correct spot, I press the decal in place with a dry, tightly wound cotton swab. I then roll away the excess water, then dab some Mr. Mark Setter over the decal to help bond that decal to the surface. I then let the setter sit for maybe a half a minute, and then wick away the excess with a swab or little pieces of paper towel. It doesn't need much since the film on these decals are quite thin. If you have much thicker decals, sometimes you'll need to apply Mark Setter to the part surface first to ensure a strong bond, but I felt like these decals didn't really need it. I repeat this process for all the decals until I'm satisfied. After finishing all the decal placement, as a final good measure, I dab a bit of Mr. Mark Softer over each decal. This will make sure the decal film melts a little more and adheres to the uneven surfaces to really sell the painted on look. I only let the Mark Softer sit about 10 seconds before carefully wicking away the excess with swabs and paper towels. It really doesn't take much Mr. Mark Softer because it's quite strong. So if you leave large pools of it on the surface, you risk leaving ugly residue or texture once it evaporates. Anyways, once I was finished with this whole process, the decals were ready for the next step. Sometimes I forget how much work painting gunplay is. In this small space, it's crazy. It's hot. Picante. Ah! Fuego. For all the parts I applied decals to, I carefully sprayed a layer of Mr. Color UV Cut Clear Gloss once more to seal in and protect all the decals. On this step, I don't cover the whole piece, only the area where I placed the decal. I let that dry completely before moving on to the next step, panel lining. To paint in all my panel lines, I chose to use Mr. Weathering Color Multi-Black, which is an oil-based paint. I prefer this over an enamel panel liner like Tamiya because it's a lot less harsh with its solvents. Enamel has a tendency to weaken plastic like ABS or cause cracks even in polystyrene if you apply too much. I've never had that problem with oil paint, and it cleans up nicely with lighter fluid. The only downside is a much longer drying time, but I feel that it's more of an advantage to allow me to manipulate the paint to where I want. Applying the paint to the panel line is very easy due to the thin viscosity of the paint. Through a process called capillary action, all we need to do is load a small, sharp brush with the paint and then touch it to each panel line. So I make sure to mix the paint in the bottle very well, and then transfer that to a small mixing cup, and then use a small brush to apply this to all the panel lines. The only parts I did not use straight up black was the yellow parts. For the yellow, I mix a custom panel line oil wash using Mr. Weathering Color Multi-Black, Mr. Weathering Color Grayish Brown, and a very small amount of Winsor & Newton Alizarin Crimson oil paint to create a reddish dark brown panel line wash. I apply this to all the recesses of the yellow parts in the same way as usual. The oil paint has a pretty long working time, so if a little bit spills out of the panel lines, I can easily clean up those areas with lighter fluid and cotton swabs. Some of the larger black stripes across the model, or areas that require a larger amount of black paint, I just simply paint in with a water-based acrylic. For these larger black areas, I just use Citadel base Abaddon Black and a thin small brush to carefully paint those in. If I do make mistakes, it's as easy as lightly rubbing those areas off with a cotton swab and water, or very gentle scrubbing with a toothpick. So I paint a few of those large black areas while I let the oil paint dry a bit. Finally, to clean off all the excess oil paint, I just use tightly wound gun cleaning swabs dipped in lighter fluid. I'll go one part at a time, taking care to be as neat as possible to leave clean looking panel lines. After cleaning all the panel lines and some of the black stripes and leaving those considerable amount of time to dry, I start painting in all the rest of the other details across the kit with water-based acrylics. For the head Vulcans, I carefully painted those in with Citadel Layer Aerial Yellow. It's a very close match to the other yellow parts on the kit, which is why I chose it. This is pretty straightforward. Using my small brush, a paper towel, cup of water, and a piece of tile as my palette, I carefully brush those areas in with a few thin layers of this, minding to keep my paint thin and my brush not overloaded. On the back of the head, there's a small green lens detail for what I'm assuming would be the rear view camera for the pilot. Anyways, I paint this very small detail carefully with a bright green paint, Citadel Tesseract Glow. The underlying white layer helps make this color pop a bit more. The inside of the verniers were also carefully painted with Aerial Yellow. Some paint did spill over, but was pretty easy to clean up with cotton swab and water. To paint the large black details of the leg armor, I returned with Citadel Abaddon Black, using a thin brush to carefully paint all those areas in. With the inside of the verniers now dry, I decided to add a bright orange wash to give the recesses some depth. To achieve this, I applied Citadel shade Cassandra Yellow, and after letting that wash dry, I applied another wash, but only to the circular hole detail in the center of each vernier. For this detail, I used Citadel shade Null Oil to create the impression of a hole. At this point, after doing all the water slide decals and having painted in all the panel lines and smaller details, the Gundam at this stage was pretty much done, so I left the model alone for about half a day to make sure everything was completely dry. To seal in all my hard work, it was time to give the white, red, blue, and yellow parts the final top coat. For my final top coat, I used Mr. Color GX 113 UV Cut Clear Flat. Despite the name, it's got a very subtle amount of sheen to it still. It's not completely flat to my eyes, something between satin and matte. Anyways, I took my time to carefully spray the parts and set those aside for a full 24 hours to ensure a completely cured surface. The next day, I carefully removed all the parts off their painting clips, making sure to remove any of the masking tape, double-sided tape, and any other pieces used to hold my parts. Once I had everything laid out, I assembled the Gundam's main body first, making sure to go slow and keep any scratches to a minimum. I then assembled the HY2M LED God Fingers, making sure to load fresh batteries needed to power the LED as indicated by the manual. The LED has a cool mechanism where it only activates when you fold the gauntlets forward. The LED is activated when the included magnet comes into contact with the housing embedded underneath. I made sure to super glue this magnet into place instead of the double-sided tape they give you. It will still be a pretty simple process to change the batteries if needed, so after assembling, I fixed those to their stands. Following this, I attached the beam saber hilts to the waist section and also assembled the action base. All that was left now was to assemble the core lander and paint the smaller and larger Domon Kashu figures. Since I was already on the core lander, I decided to paint the little Domon first, since he'll be permanently seated inside the cockpit. Sculpt is kind of mushy, almost like a Roblox character, but I did my best impressionistic painting of him with what little details molded in. Using my brand new Exemplar wet palette from Game Envy, a small selection of acrylic paints, and a very small brush, I carefully painted in the tiny seated Domon as best I could. I won't go into detail on what colors I used because I'll be showing and explaining nearly all the same colors on the larger Domon figure. You can kind of guess by seeing what's on my palette. Yeah, he looks good enough. With a small drop of super glue, I fixed him into the cockpit and assembled the rest of the core lander, which I then folded and docked into the Gundam permanently. Seriously, he's never coming out. This officially completes the final assembly of the Gundam. But we have one final piece to paint that I saved for last, the King of Hearts himself, Domon Kashu. So let me run you through this process. I've been painting miniatures for about 2 years now as another hobby. One important piece of info I've learned is that it's really important to establish a neat and uniform base coat of all the main colors first. I pulled up a quick reference from the anime and went straight in. I started with painting a thin coat on all the skin areas with Vallejo Light Flesh. Even though it looks patchy at first, I left that to dry before adding any more layers and moved on to the other sections. For the base for the khaki colored shirt, I used Vallejo Model Color Buff and blocked that in as neatly as possible. For the green undershirt, I used Citadel base Wag Flesh since it's the closest I had to that color. Turning my attention to the hair while those colors dried, I carefully blocked in his signature spiky hairdo with Vallejo Model Color German Camo Black Brown. Continuing with the apparel, I painted in the jeans with Citadel base Cantor Blue. Domon has that signature red headband. It kind of reminds me of Ryu from Street Fighter. Hadouken! Anyways, I blocked that in with Citadel Lair, Evil Sun Scarlet, taking care to also paint the separate flowing part of the headband that I'll glue in later. I also painted the shoes at this point with Vallejo Model Color Brown Violet, and the fingerless gloves are also blocked in with Citadel Lair Word Bearers Red, which is a great color for red leather in my opinion. While on the hands, I returned with Vallejo Light Flesh to start painting in the fingers as well. At this stage, I make sure that all the areas I've been painting thus far have a nice solid base coat. I turn the model around, making sure I have neat coverage all over and tidying everything up as best I can. Going back and forth is necessary. With all the base colors established, I can now paint in all the finer details. I started with the eyebrows using the same color as the hair, Vallejo Model Color German Camo Black Brown. To get the eyebrows orientation looking correct, going back and forth with light flesh and black brown was necessary to achieve the expression I'm going for. Continuing with details, I carefully painted in all the trim and rolled up sleeves of the khaki shirt with a mud-colored brown, Citadel base XV88. Tidying up with buff when necessary. To begin to add some shadow and darken the hair, Citadel Shade Drakenhof Nightshade. I applied this to all his hair to add a subtle dark blue tint to the shadows. To shade the shoes, I applied Citadel Shade Cryptek Armor Shade Gloss all over. Continuing with shades, I established some shadow on the face with Citadel Shade Seraphim Sepia, focusing on the eye sockets, brow, and mouth. For the entire khaki shirt, I applied Seraphim Sepia as well, all over, to begin to add shadow to those areas. I also applied this to the fingers on the gloves. I moved the model around at this point, manipulating the various washes to the recesses as best I could, and then left it to dry. The washes tinted a lot of the wide areas, so to bring back some of the highlights, I just returned with the original base colors and layer over all the areas I want to restore brightness to. I ended up choosing a new color for the skin, so I layered over those areas carefully with Vallejo Model Color Basic Skin Tone. For the whites of the eyes and teeth, I carefully blocked those in with Citadel Base Corax White, using a thin and sharp brush. Following this, I blocked in the pupils with German Camo Black Brown, and the reflections with a small dot of Corax White to establish those anime-esque eyes. Getting the eyes, teeth, and face looking correct was probably the hardest part of this paint job, and I did have to come back with previous colors to tidy the overall portrait of his face, but I was happy with the result eventually, after some deliberation. I also thought the shoes looked a little boring, so I decided to break up the colors a bit. I painted the front, the heel, and the straps of the shoes with Citadel Layer Doombull Brown. Following this, I also carefully paint the soles of the shoes with German Camo Black Brown. The last detail to paint in left was the belt buckle and shoe strap buttons. I painted those in with Citadel Layer Aerial Yellow. With that last detail established, Domonkashu is technically fully painted, but I had an issue with the included base, or lack thereof. The included base is just a little pad of rock that goes on the left foot, which is kind of boring. So instead, I'll use this and incorporate it into a scratch-built base. I start first by coating the entire rock base with Citadel Base XV88. After drying, I remove the rock base, Domonkashu, the headband part, and super glue all the pieces together first. The hexagon tile that I was using to handle Domon via double-sided tape makes the perfect size base for the entire figure. So I use this as a template to trace out a new base made of 2mm styrene sheet that I cut and sanded down by hand. I primed the hexagon base black, and then glued Domon down to it with super glue in the ideal positioning I wanted. Then applied a medium consistency CA glue with a toothpick and glue down different size gravel and rocky textures while working a small area at a time. The texture I use is some Art Supply diorama gravel mixed with a little bit of cat litter. After speed curing all the glue with some accelerator, I tapped away the excess and moved on to the next step. To add more variety to the base texture, I applied a texture paint from Citadel, Astro Granite, over the naked areas and various parts of the base to help blend in all the different textures a bit more. Let that dry completely before moving forward. Or if you're impatient like me, you can use a hairdryer. Just be careful and use the low setting. Once everything had a chance to completely dry, I covered the entire base with Citadel Base XV88 and then left that to dry once more. To give the base more depth, I covered the base with a dark brown wash to darken the recesses. Citadel Shade Agrax Earthshade. For a final touch of depth, I dry brushed the different areas around the base with Citadel XV88, Vallejo Model Color Buff, and Citadel Dawnstone. The different colors are to add the impression of different colored rocks and dust. I'm picturing Domon standing atop a rocky and sort of dry terrain. With the dry brushing step complete, painted the rim of the base Citadel Abaddon Black to give the entire figure a neat presentation. To really tie the figure together as a final step, I top coated the entire model with Mr. Color GX113 UV Cut Clear Flat. This unifies all the different paint finishes to one flat sheen, removing all the glossiness of some of the other paints. This also helps to really sell that anime look I'm going for. With that final top coat, that's officially a wrap on this project. If you've made it to this point in the video, I just want to say thank you for sticking around. I enjoyed building this model, and hopefully you've enjoyed seeing the process from start to finish. Huge thanks and big shout out to Gaahleri for sending me the Mobius-TG airbrush to test out and show you all. I'm very impressed with its performance and how easily I was able to comfortably blaze through the paint job on this build. And for once, my trigger finger isn't sore from all the painting. I'll definitely be using it often going forward, especially for larger builds. If you're interested in grabbing a Mobius-TG for yourself or would like to to browse any of the other various airbrushes and accessories from Gaahleri, I have a couple of affiliate links below that will get you a 10% discount on your purchase and earns me a small commission. Every little bit goes a long way in growing the channel, and I highly appreciate the support. Thank you for watching. As always, stay safe, be nice to each other, build stuff, paint stuff, and I'll see you in the next video. Here's the finish, God Gundam.